the webinar, The Most Important Word in Managerial Leadership. I'm Dwight Mahalitz. I'm the President of Effective Managers, and that's what we focus in is specifically on how can managers ensure that they are as effective as possible, and from the organization side, how can organization ensure that their managers are as effective as possible. So the title that I have for this webinar is a bit on the provocative side. So what is the most important word in management? And as you saw in the promotion for the webinar, I said that the most important word was because. And it's not because in the sense of do this because I said you must do this. It's because in the sense of do this because it's important for these reasons, A, B, C, D. And in order to be able to talk about that, we really need to think about managerial leadership in organizations. So what is managerial leadership, and why do I use that concept managerial leadership instead of the concepts of managers and leadership? So as we go through the webinar today, then there's 4 areas of content that I'd like to share with you. So the first one is a quick look at this concept of managerial leadership. The second is then getting more into the focal point of the webinar about the word because and why it's an important word. And then I would like to focus in on the heart of this webinar, which is how do you improve subordinate and team effectiveness. And then finally, a word on organizational performance. So the term managerial leadership is an important one in my sense because there's this dichotomy or perceived dichotomy between leadership and managers in many organizations. And it's a really unfortunate one in terms of thinking that leaders are these people at the top of the organization, and they do leadership stuff like inspiring and motivating, and they're future oriented and they're visionary. And in the rest of the organization, in the middle and towards the bottom, we've got managers who are stuck with the scud work, and they go to the meetings and they run the processes and they just make sure that things happen. And that cannot absolutely be further from the truth. So in terms of understanding that, I had a couple of eye-openers in personal life, as we often do. So scanning through TV at one point, I was having a look at the TV show The Family Feud, and the question was, name an animal that describes your boss. And as they went through it, what really got me and caught my attention was the negative body language and the negative words that were used to describe managers. So you know, there were a few here, so you might think of a lion as in a positive sense, but the language that was used to describe it in the body language was absolutely not in the positive sense. So the sense was that managers were people that did stuff that wasn't pleasant to you as a recipient. The other, and not too far apart in time from these, the other was the TV show Survivor. I have to admit I'm kind of addicted to this show because it's such an interesting study into human behavior and human relationships. Those of you who follow the show would know that, but those of you who don't, just a word on it, is that the concept is that you have to outwit and outsurvive other players. So that means you kind of have to scheme and lie your way up simply because of the way they set up the dynamics of the show to be a survivor. On a weekly basis, they vote someone off from the team. Where the really interesting twist is that at the end, it's those people who have been voted off that decide who the ultimate winner is. From the last 2 or 3 that are left at the end, so that sets up a very interesting dynamic. And what happened in this particular show is we had 3 tribes: the white collar tribe, the blue collar tribe, and the no collar tribe. So white collar management, blue collar workers, and no collar the entrepreneurs or the free spirits. And again, what struck me is, and you see on the screen, the kinds of words that the blue-collar people use to describe management, you know, authority, in charge, call the shots, cutthroat, make people cry. Very, very almost damning or a condemnation of the way in which managers relate to others in other parts of the organization. By the way, I've got on my YouTube channel, I've got a 17-minute excerpt from a workshop I did where I explore leadership and management using these video clips. So if you're interested, you might have fun watching that. So then the counterpoint point of that is that on a LinkedIn website, LinkedIn group called HR.com, I asked the question, what do people think of managers? So if you think about your favorite manager or your best manager, what is the one word that you would use to describe that person? And these are the kinds of words that come up. So where's the counterpoint? If generally people think of managers in such negative terms, and yet you use these kinds of words to describe your best manager, where's the dichotomy? Where's it coming in from? And I think what's happening is that in general, organizations are not getting this right. So there's this whole concept of leaders being at the top of the organization, but really in an organization, if you think about it, if you're a manager and you're accountable for leading a team, you need to be able to demonstrate leadership qualities. You need to inspire your people. You need to have a vision for that team and give them that vision. You have to motivate them, you have to give them feedback, and you have to give them direction and so on. So the whole concept of leadership and management is bound together in an inextricable way. So that's why I use the term managerial leadership. So along a fairly circuitous way of getting there, but I think it's really important for us to think about how leader managers can really make a difference in terms of their team members being effective and doing the absolute best that they can for themselves, for their teams, for your team, and therefore for the organization overall. So there are 5 things that all managers need to do to be successful in their work, and some of you were on my last webinar 3 weeks ago where we really did a deep dive into the 5 requirements of effective managers. So I talked about all 5 of these at a relatively high level. In this webinar, we're going to do the deep dive into the context and boundaries, setting context and boundaries. So that's the 3rd requirement of the 5 requirements of effective managers. The last webinar is available on my YouTube channel. You can have that there. Or if you're interested in any of the white papers around that, you can either drop me an email or leave me some feedback in the feedback at the end of this webinar, and I will get that off to you. So then in terms of setting context and boundaries, and I am keeping my eye on the clock because we had a late start, but in the terms of context and boundaries then, we're really thinking about how do I appropriately delegate work down the organization. So on this slide, there's a few things that we have to bear in mind. So the first of all, you as a manager are accountable for doing your own value-added work. I know it's also a misperception in organizations that primarily at the front level of work is, boy, if I could only be a manager, then I don't have to work. I only tell other people to work. That can't be further from the truth, because in fact, each level of the organization does need to add value in terms of your value-added work. And then we delegate people to delegate work to those people who are on our team, and require them to do certain work that they are accountable for, and give them the authority to do that work. The blue line here is that important thing that I call context and boundaries. So if you think about how work is delegated, it would be an impossible task for a manager to tell a worker, do this, okay, now do this, okay, you're finished that, yeah, that's good, now do this. I mean, that is not the role of a manager. The role of a manager is to help to set context so people can take initiatives and make decisions and do their work in the way which would be compatible with what you would want, but without you necessarily having to tell them what to do every day. So the context and boundaries is really then setting the way in which work, the nature in which way work is done. So we can have 2 issues with the setting of context and boundaries. So one issue is that we could set the context to be too narrow. So if it's too narrow, it is erring on that side of the do this, then do this, then do this side. It's often called micromanaging in terms of the employee, the subordinate feels that the manager is looking over the shoulder, redoing their work, too close, breathing down their neck. All of those terms are common in organizations or in teams where this happens. But there is could be an issue on the other end of the spectrum where you're actually setting the context to be too broad. So this is where the manager kind of says, well, they're adults, they've got a job description, they know what to do. I get out of their way and let them get on with their work. So from this perspective, the subordinates of a manager that's in that situation feel that they don't have access. They feel that they're not supportive. They're feeling abandoned in their work, and of course they do the best that they can in most cases, but they don't feel that they're getting the appropriate direction in order to be able to make the right decisions to do their work well. So one of the challenges that we have that in terms of setting context and boundaries is how do we right size this, because it really is critical in terms of successful delegation in organizations, so that we can set the appropriate level of context so that people can use their initiative, can get work done, but do have the appropriate amount of access to you as the manager. So now, as an aside, before we move on to the next level, I want to really stress this. So in terms of setting context and boundaries, we are not talking about command and control. That is kind of the opposite almost of the context and boundaries concept. So we're trying to right size the context and boundaries so that people can use their initiatives, but they don't have to make up everything as they go along either. So it isn't command and control, because organizations are just too big, too complex, there's too much interdependence to be able to operate successfully in that way. We are also not talking about anarchy. So when I hear a lot of managers talk in organizations talking about empowerment or liberating their employees, they're actually abdicating their managerial accountability and authority by creating the self-managed team, almost, in terms of you guys go ahead and you do your stuff and keep me informed. So that's too far in the other way, because that creates a framework or a situation in which people just aren't able to get the appropriate support in terms of doing their work. So what we're about today in this one, in terms of setting context and boundaries, is how do we find the right balance between the command and control, not good, between anarchy, not good, in terms of finding a way for managers to be as effective as they can. Because at the end of the day, effective managers are going to be able to help you execute the goals that you have for your department, and in doing that, the organization overall will be able to achieve its strategy. So it's finding this chain, this link, this wonderful interdependence of all of the units of the organization, each working on those things for which they're accountable and delivering results, but in a concerted, cooperative way, so that the organizational strategy can be achieved within the guidelines that are necessary. So just a bit of an aside here, because I think in terms of setting context and boundaries, there's two really important differentiators that we have to bear in mind. And one concept that is really important is this one around situational leadership. This was first published back in 1969 by Hersey and Blanchard. Ken Blanchard's the guy of the 1 Minute Manager. You may have heard of him. I was introduced to this, excuse me, in the 1980s by Marshall Goldsmith, who's now a very successful, world-known management coach, executive coach, I guess you'd call him. And he was doing work on excellent management at that point, and I was just delighted to work with Marshall Goldsmith. But anyway, what stuck with me was this concept about situational leadership. So if you look at this figure quickly, on the left you see supportive. So how much, we use the word leadership here, I would use the word management, but managerial leadership does it as well. So how supportive do I need to be between low and high? More supportive or less supportive? How close do I have to be? How narrow or wide does my context and boundaries need to be? And then on the right is the directive side. So how directive do I need to be from low to high? And there are two things that are really important here. So if you're a new manager coming into the organization, so you've got a new team member coming in, at the new team member, of course, you have to be supportive, but you also have to be more directive, because that person isn't is new, and they have learning to do, and therefore don't have as much direct knowledge. There also may be situations where, for whatever reasons, one of your team members who has been performing well for a long period of time is getting into a situation, or maybe you've given them a more complex assignment than usual. Maybe they're running into unforeseen obstacles in terms of their work, where you might have to be more directive. So thinking about this in terms of delegating, so you're tell somebody to do something, then kind of back away is low supportive and low directive, to having to be more supporting to them, to having to do more coaching to help coach them through a situation, to be actually directing someone to do the work that's necessary. So as I go through these next sections, I think it's important to bear in mind that while all of them are important, the amount of time that you spend on them and the nature of how you actually implement this will depending on each one of your subordinates. The last point I make on this slide is that each one of your subordinates will be in a different place. Excuse me. So you cannot treat all of your subordinates in exactly the same way. So certainly you can have a team, and you can work with the team, and you must work with the team as a team, but you also need to do this work with each individual. And for the rest of the this webinar, I'm focusing in on how we do this work as on one-on-one delegation. So the first point is that in terms of context and boundaries, there are four different elements that are important. And you can think of these as broader to narrower, so starting at the corporate level, moving down to the department or the team level, then thinking about the role individually, and then thinking about working relationships. So how do I work with this individual? How do I expect that individual to work with me? The second point I'd make on this is that we have to think about the difference between kind of that induction setting of context and boundaries, which is relatively static, and the ongoing context and boundaries, which is changing. So when a new person joins the team, there is this induction period, which takes more time, and which requires you to give new information to them in a way that is going to help them understand their job and your working relationship. But it's not done. At that point, you as a manager need to think about how you're going to do this in a continuing way that's going to make sense to them. And I'm going to cover both of these off in a couple of different ways. So at the corporate sense, and again, these are examples, so some of this is intuitive, so I'm really trying to give you more of a setting or a framework in which you can think about how do you help your team members to be more effective. So in terms of the corporate or the environmental context and boundaries, these are some of the things that you need to think about and to talk about with each of your team members. So what you're doing here is you're setting context about how we work in this organization and what it is that we do in this organization. So this is our corporate strategy. This is where we want to be in 5 or 10 years. This is the direction that we in this department are working to help drive the corporation for success in its strategy over the next 5, 7, 10 years, whatever it might be. Discussions around the business model. So these are our clients. This is how we, whether you're for-profit, not-for-profit, or governmental, and however you divide client or service recipient, these are the people that we work for and with, and this is how we do our work. And then there's stuff around corporate policies and regulations. So this is more on the boundary side. So this is the framework within which we must do our work, and we can't exceed those. So we will work within policy. These are regulations that we need to abide by, and then anything else in terms of handbooks, manuals, processes, process mapping, things that can help the person understand how it is that we do work. So here we're really thinking about the organizational context, and that becomes important because you don't want to always have to be available to answer questions, and you do want people to have enough information to be able to make decisions that would be consistent with how you would make decisions or how you would decide if you were asked the question. So this is all about how we work at this organization and the boundaries within which we work in the organization. At the next level down, and these are hierarchical to a degree, so at the next level down, we're then starting to talk about and work with each of your subordinate team members to think about department and team. So from your sense, this is your department, but for them to understand how they fit in, it's helpful, I find, to start talking about your own boss's plan. So if you're a department, they're a division. If that's a department, you might be a business unit of some kind. But so thinking about your boss's plan, vision, and goals. So where your kind of next up in the organization is going, what its important contributions are to the organization and its strategy, and therefore where your peers are taking their respective teams in terms of helping your common boss achieve his or her plan, vision, and goals. That then also gives you the context for talking about your own plan, because you should have a plan. That's the first of the 5 requirements of effective managers. You should have a vision for your business unit, whether it's a division, department, whatever it might be, and you will have personal goals. So by you don't have to give this in precise detail, but you do have to give enough information to each of your subordinates so that they can understand what your priorities are, where you're trying to drive your organizational unit, what your vision is for your organizational unit, and where you want to get it up, and why your work is important to the overall success of the organization, and instilling that pride in the work of you and your team, and therefore why their contribution is going to be so important. The fourth area is around team and team roles, and again, because we work in highly interdependent organizations, you are going to want to ensure that you're setting enough context that each one of your subordinate team members understands each other's work as well, and how their work is interrelated and as a whole combines to the success of the team, so that they can develop their working relationships and understand the handoffs on any processes that might take place within your own work unit, and how they can collaborate and work together. And then the last point I thought on this one is around the cross-functional relationships. So your organizational unit, again, does not exist in isolation. You're working in an organization where you're collaborating with your peers that report to your common boss, and you're also probably collaborating with peers in other parts of the organization. If you're in HR, you're absolutely working with others in other parts of the organization. Those of you that are not in HR will be working with others in other parts of the operations to collaborate in that way. So helping them understand those cross-functional relationships, the importance of working together, and in this one, most importantly, if they have a disagreement, your expectation that they will come back to you and help and ask you to help work through how that can be resolved, which is a wonderful segue into the next area, which is around the role itself. So in terms of the role, there are a lot of tools that exist to support people in understanding their roles. So the position description is a key one. I cannot believe how many organizations I go into that don't have written position descriptions, and that is a problem, partly because it's a gap in the organization in terms of understanding what all of the work is, but more importantly is that it's a very important tool that is missing in your toolbox as a manager that describes your role and describes each of the roles of your subordinates. Partly it's static in terms of this is describing the role, as static as anything can be in an organization, but partly it's the ongoing aspect of a tool that you can use to have ongoing discussions with each of your team members around what's different, what's changing, is this still accurately describe your job? If it doesn't, how can we improve it? So it becomes a way of continuous improvement for context in terms of what is the work that they're ultimately responsible for. There's the second element here is for that role. they should also have a plan, vision, and goals. So each one of your team members should have a plan. It doesn't have to be complex. It can be a half a page, but in terms of the vision for their team. So if you're a manager of managers, that manager has a team as well, has to do all of this work that you're doing with each one of their team members. And you, as their manager, would want to know what is their plan for their organizational unit. In fact, you would have a lot of input into that and would approve their plan and their vision and their goals. So make sure that each one of your subordinates has that. Make sure that you have that. And then around position priorities, this is part of the discussion in the position description, but I find position description, I think of that as describing the day job. There's a lot of other stuff that happens in an organization that is delegated in other ways that you need to talk about. So having discussions about role priorities, how to resolve priorities, helping them to ensure that they have the number of hours that are necessary to do everything that's important, and if not, then working with them to resolve those priorities. This is, again, is something that a manager cannot abdicate. It becomes incredibly important that managers have the accountability for helping their subordinates to work through priorities so that they do have the resources, including their own personal time, to be able to do what is necessary to be done. And there we go into resourcing is the next one, and then finally next level team roles. So as the manager one level removed, you have some accountability for understanding that work 2 levels down, how work is being delegated there, and the success or not of people in that role. And that brings us to the fourth area, which is the manager-subordinate relationship. So up until now, we've been talking about content. So how do I set context and boundaries for how you do your work, at the corporate level, at the organizational level, and at the individual level? Now we talk about how do you and I work together. And this becomes really important because, if you don't say what your expectations are in terms of their interrelationships with you, they will be guessing. Why make them guess? Why not just be really clear in terms of how you expect that relationship to work? One of the most important ones is open door or not. It's quite fair for a manager to say that there's certain periods of times when you're focusing in on your own value-added work, and unless it's an emergency, and again, set out what that looks like, that you would prefer not to be disturbed. But your subordinate team members do need access to you, and they need it in a way in which is appropriate for your respective roles. So you need to work that through. The second one is around problem solving, and one of the biggest pet peeves I have in organizations is managers that use this phrase, come to me with solutions, not with problems. And it sounds good. It sounds like that would be the right way, that if somebody runs into a problem, they should come up with a solution and come to you. And for work that they should be doing at their own level, I think that's right. But there will and there should be situations, if people are working at the limits of their capability and you're delegating appropriately, where they will run into unexpected roadblocks and they will have a problem that's at a higher level of complexity than they are going to be able to resolve at their level. And you, as their manager, will have that higher level of perception of ability to work at a higher level of complexity that only you in your position will be able to solve that problem. So the trick here is finding that right balance. Again, so much in life is about balance between what kinds of decisions you expect them to make. So if they come to you for a decision that you think they should be making, tell them that. If they make the wrong decision, give them that feedback. If they make the right decision, give them that feedback, so that you're coaching them to make the decisions that you want them to be able to make. On the other hand, if they ever make a decision that you believe was beyond their authority, or that you would have wanted to be involved in, then that's where the open door comes in, and this is the nature of those kinds of problems that you should be bringing to me so that I can add value to your role, remove an obstacle, support you in terms of your work and being successful in your work. The third, I referred to this third one in the last slide, and this is around cross-functional issues resolution. So if you run into a situation if one of your subordinates runs into a situation in terms of working with others outside of your department, what do you expect them to do in terms of either resolving that issue on their own or escalating it to you so that you can help them resolve it. And again, many organizations may not have an issues resolution process, but if you're working with a peer in another part of the organization and the two of you are coming at a particular issue from very different perspectives, and it's substantively important to you in your role and your success, the best way to resolve that is for each of the two of you to escalate it to your respective managers so that you can try to come up with how your two departments, units should be working together, as opposed to the two of you making a trade-off that may be suboptimal for the organization overall. So so your expectations of each of your subordinates in that respect is really, really important. And then finally, keeping commitments up, down, and across. What are your expectations of your team member keeping commitments that have been made to you, that have been made to their own team members, or that have been made to others, either to other team members on your team or to other parts of the organization. And of course, that's straightforward from my perspective, is that if someone makes a commitment, they need to keep that commitment. I read some research lately that, just recently, that only 9% of managers believe that they can count on peers and other parts of the organization keeping their commitments. And I mean, that's just a horrible, horrible statistic. And what we need to do is build trust in organizations that if we say we're going to do something, that we will do it. And that becomes really important for us to work that through, and for each of us as managers to set those expectations. So at the end of the day, this is about leadership. I've just given you some insight. I think we could probably talk for a week about how one sets context, but each of us as managers are in very different situations and need to work that through. So the leadership part of a role is critically important. The dual term managerial leadership, I think, is really important, because it's two sides of one coin. Leaders can't lead without managing, and managers can't manage without leading, and we need to bear that in mind, because at the end of the day, it is all about the team. So how do we ensure that each one of our team members has the information that they require to be successful in terms of taking initiatives and doing work, and also to be able to contribute to your success, because each of them are pulling together and doing what they need to do in the right framework. I've got three notes I want to elaborate on for you before we close the webinar. The first one is on delegation itself. Excuse me again. I had mentioned earlier that in terms of delegation, we have the job description, which is kind of work that people can do as their day job, so they know what needs to be done. So you don't need to delegate that on a day-to-day basis. But there's a whole other bunch of work that is mostly around strategic initiatives or change initiatives, where you are specifically delegating additional work that needs to be done in a specific time frame. With regard to both of those types of work, I find this framework, which we've adapted from the work of Elliot Jacks, to be very helpful. So if you think about work in terms of QQTR, so QQT constrained by R, so Q is quality. What is the quality of the work that needs to take place? So what is, as your manager, what do I expect in terms of quality? The second is what is quantity? What is the quantity of work that I expect? So how much? So how much and how good? Quantity and quality. What is the timeliness? So by what time do I expect this work to be done? And then the fourth one is the resources. So what are the resources that you have available to do this? So in terms of their own team members, so budget for personnel, equipment, and their own personal time. So what is the time that they need to be able to do that work? Some of the biggest mistakes I've ever made as a manager myself have been when I've delegated something to someone thinking that it was a 2 to 4 hour job and that they'd be back the next day with that, and asking in a week where it was, and finding out, getting the answer that, oh, well, I've done this outline, I've asked finance for this support, IT is putting together a specialized software for me to gather the data in this way, and I'm going, what? I wasn't about any of that. I wanted you to do this, this, and this, which should have been, take you 2 or 3 hours to do, when they interpreted a much more in-depth task, thinking about it from their level, and really were carrying a much heavier load than the expectation would have been. Probably would have been a much better product at the end of the day, but I hadn't expected 2 weeks of their time to be taken up on something that I didn't think was that important to be done. So having that two-way conversation in terms of the feedback loop about what are my expectations, what are the resources that you need in terms of time, and making sure that you agree on those. So the second note that I want to make is in terms of communication, because when you look at employee engagement surveys, at the top of every list that I've ever seen, if it's not the top, it's the second one, is that communication is a problem in organizations. And I believe that is there not because people don't communicate. I mean, there's lots of, if just listen to the water cooler talk, there's lots of communication going on in organizations. What's happening is that from the perspective of the employees, and your subordinate managers are employees of the organization, they're not getting the right information at the right time. So it's kind of like, they're working on this project, it's been delegated to them, they're full speed ahead, they're spending a lot of time and effort on it, and then they find out around the water cooler that the project has been delayed or canceled or changed, and they weren't aware of that. So from their perspective, they've been wasting time and effort on something that they didn't have to be doing. So who can get the right message to that individual in terms of them not having to work on that anymore? The only person that can do that in the right time is the manager of that person. So each manager, as part of their managerial accountability, is to reset context in an ongoing way. So if one of your team members has been delegated to be sitting on a team, and there's a change on that, somehow from where that change was decided, probably at the executive management team, the VP needs to communicate to the director, needs to communicate to the manager so that the person knows what's happening. By the time it gets to the water cooler, or by the time it goes out in an email, it's not going to be timely. A part of the manager's role is to right-size information and to pass that information on to those that need to have that information in a timely way, and that only that will improve communication. So context, then setting context, revising context is a critically important role in that respect. The third and final note I make on this is around collaboration, because if communication is number one in terms of problems on employee engagement surveys, collaboration is number two. If this one's number one, then communications is number two. And this is exactly the same issue, but from a different perspective. So the conversation at the water cooler goes something along the lines that I promised my boss, this could be you, that I would have this report for her or him today. And last week I went to finance and I asked them to give me the data that I was going to need, and they said they would have it for me yesterday. And you know what? I called them yesterday and they said they didn't get to it and they're not going to get to it until next week. So now I've made a promise to my boss, and I'm not going to be able to get that project to them. So here's the, and then the corollary to that is, boy, do we have poor collaboration, or boy, do we have poor teamwork in this organization. So organizations see something like this on employee engagement surveys, so they send people away on team training exercises to try to build better collaboration. But again, it comes down to a lack of clarity of accountability and authority framework in the organization, or context setting by respective managers. So somehow in finance, the preparation of this report, which was a commitment made, a promise made, doesn't feel to have the same amount of importance or weight or priority as work within the department. So what we really need to do is ensure that managers are doing that work to the degree that they can understand how they will collaborate together in terms of respective accountabilities and authority. So it does come down to managerial leadership. And it comes down to organizations having a framework as well for accountability and authority in the organization. So I said I would give you a couple of slides on the organizational framework, and there's only 2 points I'd like to make, the slide and the next one. So the first one is that in terms of how well are we doing as an organization. At Effective Managers, we've developed an assessment tool for manager effectiveness, which we've successfully used with CEOs and heads of HR to survey all managers in organization to understand things like how effective do they feel they are. The benchmark, by the way, says that managers feel they're only spending 55% of their time on value-added work. So 45% of their time is being, well, maybe not quite wasted, but it's being spent on stuff that they do not see as being effective. So it's organizational churn that is going to meetings that they shouldn't have to go to, and reading email they shouldn't have to read, and being in conflict situations that they shouldn't have to be in. So the assessment tool is available to organizations. The other is that in terms of improving this at the organizational level, and we've had some very good success working with CEOs in this regard, is ensuring that the organization has an accountability and authority framework in place in terms of, one, how we manage here, but two, how we collaborate here, so that we have an ability to have this work flowing down the organization in a consistent way, and work flowing across the organization in a consistent way. I call this the rules of the road. So this is how we work together in this organization. This is working together in a way that makes sense and collaborates. So that brings me to the end of the content. I'll check for questions in just a second, but in closing, I did want to make you aware that on the Effective Managers website, effectivemanagers.com, it's just chock full of resources that are available to managers. So part of our mandate is giving back to community, and to me, community is organization. So helping managers to be more effective. So it's full of resources. You can find there the paper on the five requirements of effective managers. You can also find the 3 capabilities of an effective manager, and how to ensure that you have the right people in the right roles, and so on. The other resource that I have for you is the YouTube channel. This will be the 35th webinar that is recorded and is available. This one will be available later today, and the other 34 are there now. You can search for Dwight Mahalitz, or you can search for Effective Managers. And on the website, there are also links that will bring you to this YouTube channel, and here you can find information that will be helpful to you and can give you a deeper dive into some of the concepts that we talked about today. So in closing, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Looking at the questions, I do have a couple of questions here, and we've got a few minutes, so I think we're going to be okay. So question number 1. So if I do all of this and there's no improvement in performance, what do I do then? That's a very good question, a very, very good question, because anything I've been talking about today has kind of assumed capability. So I've assumed that you're working with an individual that's fully capable in the role. So if you've got capable team members, how do you ensure that those capable team members are as effective as possible? So what happens when you have a team member that's not capable? The white paper I just referred to talked about the 3 fundamental capabilities of individuals. So typically there's 3 things that can be going wrong, personality aside. So there's 3 things that could be going wrong. One is that person is in the right role. There's a concept, again, developed by Elliot Jacks around complexity of work in organizations and capability of individuals to work in organizations. So the more senior you are in the organization, so the higher the level, the more complex the work. So if you think about it, the work of a VP, which might take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to complete, is more complex than the work of a frontline worker. So you have really precise, distinct boundaries of work between entry-level work, frontline manager or professional work, director level work, vice president level work, and so on. And one of the biggest problems that I see in organizations is that when there's a vacancy of a manager, the best team member is promoted into that managerial position. Sometimes it works, but most often it doesn't work because they were ideally suited to the job that they were doing, so they don't have the capability to that work at that next level of complexity. So if you have someone that's in that situation, they're going to be trying to do work for which they don't have the fundamental problem-solving capability to be successful in that work. So that's an issue. I've got articles on the website on that. The second is the skills and knowledge. If they don't have the skills and knowledge to do that work in particular, then they're going to be stumbling, because you will be expecting them to be able to do things without a skill set to be able to do it. So this is where you have to get into that more directive area in terms of do this in this way, and perhaps even do more coaching in terms of how to do the work, or set up a team effort where they can observe others doing the work to be able to learn how to do that. The interesting challenge that you have as a manager in diagnosing these two things, because sometimes they look similar. Somebody might have the full capability but not have the skills, or somebody might have what appear to be the skills but not have the capabilities, that you do have to differentiate on those two. The other point is that the problem-solving capability cannot be trained. People have to mature to be able to be successful at the next level of the organization. It's a maturation process in your mental processing. In the same way one matures to be a certain height, one matures to have a certain color of hair or hair pattern, one matures to have a certain level of mental processing, or as I call it, problem-solving capability. But skills and knowledge, the good news is that can be trained. So if you identify that as the gap by providing the training, that will be helpful. The third concept is application. Does the person really value that work? Or did they apply for promotion into that job because of the title, because of the compensation, and so on? So if they don't really value that work, they're not going to apply themselves completely in that work, and that one can be coached as well. So anyway, there, download, if this is an issue you have, download that paper, and it'll give you more information on that. If you work through each one of those three and you troubleshoot on that and you're not successful, then probably the person is not in the right role, and it is time to start thinking about how do you find a way for that person to get into the right role. And believe me, you're not doing yourself a favor, and you're not doing that person a favor by keeping someone in a role when they're not being successful in it. They're stressing out because they know they're not doing well. You're stressing out because you know they're not doing well. So by avoiding the decision about getting them into the right situation, and sometimes that means leaving the organization to find the right situation, it can be done in a humane and helpful way, but sometimes it just has to be done. Now the last question, and we've got 1 minute left, so I'll only give you the 1 minute on it. Oh yes. In our organization, we have terrible workflow. What do I do if other managers and other parts of the organization aren't collaborating because of silos? That is a problem, and that's why I choose to work with CEOs in my practice, because you can get the biggest and the best bang for the buck if the CEO is implementing an organizational wide accountability and authority framework for how work flows down and across the organization. The advice I would have for you is that if you follow these practices within your own departmental unit, you can experience significant improvements within your department. So you have to start with what you can control, where you have the accountability and authority, and do that. And then through influence sideways, if you can, try to convince your peers to adopt similar practices. But at the end of the day, while you can recommend these kinds of things up the organization, you don't have the authority to implement these things organization-wide. So all you can do is the best you can do with what you do have authority for, and send a link to my website to the CEO, and perhaps we can help them improve other parts of the organization. And feel free to be in touch with me at any time if you have any questions about any of this stuff. As you can tell, I love talking about it. Anyway, thank you again. Really appreciate your time. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Hi, I'm Dwight Mahalitz, President of Effective Managers. Thank you so much for downloading the webinar. I hope that you enjoyed it and will find it useful. Feel free to check out other parts of the website for interesting downloads. Most are free, some are at a nominal charge, but I'm sure you'll find lots of interesting tools there and things that can help you be more effective. And in fact, that's what my job is. My job is to help you, help your organization be higher performing. The bottom line is that I want to start where you are, understand your problem, and provide services that can help you solve that problem and implement a solution as quickly and as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Give me a call, drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you, talk about your situation, and see if there's anything that we can do together. Thank you.